Fatal Frame is a classic horror game that first released on the PlayStation 2 back in 2001. It was made by Tecmo before they merged with Koei in 2009 to become Koei Tecmo. When booting up the game for the first time, you're met with its title screen with its full name being Fatal Frame based on a true story. Alright, that's a bit strange. It even states it on the front of the American cover art but not the European or Japanese version, but let's come back to this point in a few moments. The story of Fatal Frame has our main lead Miku Hinasaki explore the haunted Himuro mansion to find her brother Mafuyu, who you play as in the game's opening but ends up lost by the time Miku visits the place. I couldn't help but be reminded of Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube with just how similar both of these openings are. Anyway, moving on. When exploring this place, you'll find out the origins of why the Himuro residence is so haunted, with how they perform these rote rituals on young maidens, and as a result of its twisted practices, one of its previous victims, Kyrie, now haunts the place. Her hate and malice as an apparition shows no mercy for those that enter this building, with Kyrie alongside other residents and victims of the past killing every one of its visitors that have previously tried to document just what's been happening within this mansion. The game's story had enough to keep me invested to see things through, and its simple premise of finding Miku's brother allows Fatal Frame to also throw a bunch of other subplots at the player, which are all equally as interesting and fill out the bigger picture. The game's director, Makoto Shibata, wanted to create the scariest gaming experience possible at the time with the first Fatal Frame game, and was inspired by the success of the Silent Hill series when it came to making this vision into a reality. You can see certain similarities between how both games go about using horror in its gameplay, with Fatal Frame also making clever use of its backtracking, having the game actually know when the player is returning to previous locations in an area and setting up certain set pieces and traps to throw them off guard. You're never truly safe here, even when you think you know the layout of Himuro Mansion. The game constantly tries to one-up the player and keep you on your toes at all times with its scares and smaller details. Fatal Frame's use of horror through backtracking is something that really makes the title stand out, since you can only really achieve this level of immersion and tension in a video game. This is since, for example, you don't backtrack for a film or book, so horror can't be implemented the same way with those mediums. It's something that's only exclusive to the interactive format of a video game, since you're the one in control of the character on screen. As a horror game, this title still holds up remarkably well even when playing it in the modern day. Fatal Frame's atmosphere truly is second to none when it comes to making you feel afraid and vulnerable. The ghosts that you encounter slowly enter the area that you're in, and they're accompanied with these bizarre and off-putting audio tracks which is exclusive to each one and can honestly be more scarier than the enemies themselves when playing in a pitch black room wearing headphones. It's well worth listening to, since words themselves simply can't do this kind of atmosphere any justice. Unlike a lot of horror games out there, Fatal Frame can actually be scarier when it wants to be. Outside of its use of audio and backtracking, it can also make you feel extremely vulnerable as you control its protagonist, Miku. How it manages to achieve this is with the game's primary and only weapon that you have access to, that being the iconic camera obscura. The camera's origins is a complete mystery, with it originally belonging to Miku's mother until she went mad from it, resulting in her death. The camera obscura allows the player to see that what can't be seen. You can use it to solve puzzles, find hints on where to go next, and most importantly, fight back against the ghostly victims of Himuro Mansion. This weapon lends itself incredibly well to the atmosphere of Fatal Frame. It's not just some generic gun or baseball bat that you typically see in a lot of games from this genre, and instead serves multiple uses. It also complements the genre way more because of this. Allow me to explain why for a moment. So each time that you pull out the camera obscura, you enter this first person view, making yourself more vulnerable with how you can't run away and are instead forced to stand still, staring at these ghosts face to face as you line up your shot to deal the most amount of damage with each snap of the camera. Fatal Frame marked the beginning of a short-lived horror trend that you started to see during the 6th generation of gaming in its genre on the PlayStation 2. Rather than using a weapon that made you feel strong and powerful like a gun or metal pipe, you instead had this amazing subgenre that would feature more unique instances of gameplay where you actually felt vulnerable. For instance, you had games like Rule of Rose or Haunting Grounds where you only relied on your dog companion to deal with enemies. There was also Clock Tower 3, which centered around you running away and hiding from your pursuers. It's a style that I found horror titles in the modern day pretty much lack. I love most horror games out there, but I've always found this dissonance in the genre between being scared and having a literal gun where I can simply shoot the bad guy in the head at any moment. I just find personally that traditional weapons in horror games kinda take away from that feeling of actually being vulnerable. It's something that the first Fatal Frame game immediately gripped me with whilst playing this title for the first time, and it's well worth complimenting with how well it fits with the genre compared to other games because of this. In the same vein as many other survival horror releases at the time, you're limited in what film you can find for the camera obscura. These pretty much act as ammo times to put it simpler. Some deal more damage than others, but they are all limited. I recommend picking some up at every save point. It's a feature I didn't realise was in the game until I nearly ran out. Speaking of, another point about the save rooms is that they aren't actually safe. Apparitions can practically spawn anywhere randomly, even in these areas, so you'll always want to keep your guard up in these rooms. There's also health pickups which are pretty scarce, so you'll only want to heal up when it's completely necessary. Each new chapter does bring Miku back to full health, so that's worth bearing in mind. Another key aspect of Fatal Frame's gameplay that's worth bringing up is how you can actually upgrade the camera obscura. Each time you defeat an enemy, they'll give you what the game simply calls points, and these can be spent to upgrade the camera's range, speed and max value, or more specifically how much damage you can deal. Strangely enough, it's nice actually being incentivized to attack this game's apparitions with its RPG inspired mechanic. If it wasn't for this, fights would give you no incentive to engage with them since you'd be spending what limited resources you'd have for nothing in return. It's an out there comparison, but without this simple method to level up and get stronger, fights would feel like how stickers were in Paper Mario Sticker Star, with how the game lacked any central mechanic to give the player experience. These concepts and ideas are just some of the ways that Fatal Frame stands out from more conventional horror games. As the player, you'll want to get as up close and personal to these entities as possible to net yourself the highest amounts of points to spend on upgrades. A lot of survival horror games reward the player for simply running away from every enemy and hoarding ammo, which can sometimes disrupt the flow of gameplay, especially in more older titles. You're more or less being punished for spending resources, but Fatal Frame honestly gets around this issue by having a central mechanic that rewards the player for engaging with its combat by making them stronger, which is something it pulls off remarkably well even when playing this game in the modern day. Moving on, as is the standard for this channel, I need to mention for a moment just how well Fatal Frame goes about its use of fixed camera perspectives. I'll try to keep this passionate talk brief, so as previously mentioned in my other videos, a fixed camera can go hand in hand with the horror genre. The lack of being able to see what's in front of you only adds to that feeling of vulnerability, and on a cinematography level, it creates this effect that every frame you're looking at was directed by someone. This also makes it so that there are no unsafe rare or immersion breaking angles that can be made by the player. So one thing Fatal Frame does with its use of the fixed camera that kinda shocked me whilst playing is rarely in some moments it will use a fixed perspective one time and then go back to the same shot. It's kind of hard to explain just what I mean by this, but what it does to the person playing is that it gives them the idea that they're being watched, and that lack of control over the camera even when expecting it during backtracking moments to snap to specific angles that you've seen before can be used to surprise the player. Alright, I understand if that point was a bit out there, but if you love fixed cameras like I do and how they can be used to elevate a game's atmosphere, then you'll appreciate how it's utilised in Fatal Frame. So far in this video I've been pretty positive about Fatal Frame, but there were quite a few issues I found with this game that can somewhat hold it back at times. Its opening is solid and keeps you invested with its story, but I quickly found myself having to rely on a guide every now and then since the game doesn't always make it clear where you have to go next. Things start off well designed with you snapping a shot at everything that looks out of the ordinary, with you then being given a hint as to where to go next in order to progress. But as Himura Mansion opens up, these images showing where to go next can be easy to confuse for other areas, or you can just have no idea where the game is actually telling you where to go. If you don't mind having a guide on hand to get through these moments, then they aren't really an issue. A lot of horror games from this era were a bit obtuse when they wanted to be. But by far my biggest issue with Fatal Frame has to be with its pretty harsh difficulty curve that you start to see during Night 3. Some of this can feel cheap, like how certain apparitions from this point won't stop teleporting around. And you'll also have next to no healing items either if you played like I did, so be prepared to die a lot, with save points being less frequent than would be ideal. Also, sometimes the random enemy spawns can play to the game's more frustrating moments. For instance, in my playthrough, I had a generic enemy spawn right next to a mandatory boss in the same room, and I've not yet mentioned, but you can easily be in a stun loop against more than one ghost, which isn't exactly something you want to be up against. But despite these minor grievances, the team behind Fatal Frame should have been proud of what they've achieved here. The game isn't all that long, so these more tedious sections aren't actually as offensive as they might come off in this review. Before continuing on, I'd like to bring up something I mentioned at the start of this video. This game's full title in America was Fatal Frame based on a true story. This line really stood out to me. What about the events of the first Fatal Frame have anything in common with real life? I mean, most of what happens is completely fictitious, right? So researching this part of the video has been a real rabbit hole. There's this incredibly in-depth video I found by the gaming muse going into this topic with more nuance. But to put it simpler, from my findings, browsing whatever sites and articles I could find, the ties between Fatal Frame and any of this being based on a real story is something made up by the localizers of this game to sell more copies in America. Apparently it had something to do with how the Blair Witch used it previously in advertising to great effect, which is why it was done here. What's strange though is as with any story like Fatal Frame, which clearly takes inspiration from Japanese mythology and yokai, there has been debates online over which aspect of this game is taken from real world inspiration. I even found a pretty high profile video of someone finding Hero Mansion in real life, and look in the title, it even says real life Fatal Frame. So is it really just nonsense conjured up for marketing? I'm gonna leave that one for interpretation. However, personally, I'm going to say that this is in fact not based on a true story, and trying to pinpoint what real world location Fatal Frame is even based on is an entire other debate that goes well beyond the scope of this review. If you have any evidence for or against the real world inspiration behind the first Fatal Frame game, then please let me know in the comments, it would be appreciated. It's frustrating though, since any research on this topic kinda leaves you going around in circles with could-be and apparent interviews that lack any evidence on whether or not they're actually real. But if this game was actually based on a true story, then it would have been known by now, and it would also have been featured on the PAL and Japanese covers for this game. Anyway, I'll have to move on or I'll be debating this point all day. Speaking of, let's talk about regional and version differences between this title. So one of the most well-known facts about Fatal Frame is how in Europe this series is known as Project Zero, and in Japanese it's titled as simply just Zero. Despite being from the UK, I never really clicked with its directly translated name of Project Zero. It sounds very codenamed and doesn't really bring anything into the front of my mind. Whereas with Fatal Frame, you immediately think of the iconic camera that's featured in all these games. It's a good example of localization being done well. If you say to someone, have you ever heard of Project Zero, they'll probably look at you strange, but if you said ever heard of Fatal Frame, they'll go, oh yeah, that's the one with the camera, right? It's a far better name in my opinion. Anyway, what I won't compliment however is America's terrible cover art for this game. The Xbox version also looks really bad. The PAL and Japanese box arts look way better, with them prominently featuring the game's protagonist Miku on the cover, which gives you a better idea of what this title is. Some more noteworthy pieces of localization would also be the voice acting for Fatal Frame. The main character Miku performs her role incredibly well for a release from this generation, and her more airy tone fits the unsettling vibe of the game.
My brother was in search of someone. Junsei Takamine, a famous novelist, and a man my brother was very indebted to, disappeared while researching a book.
That being said, a lot of the side characters, and especially the ghost, can have some, let's just say, dubious performances. But as a whole, the voice acting is actually pretty good here. One last localization difference is how they actually changed Miku's look and in-game model from the Japanese version, giving her a different facial structure and brown hair instead of black. You'd think this change will be met with some issues from the original team, but they actually went with it for the Xbox re-release of Fatal Frame both in Japan and worldwide, which also added an extra difficulty mode and ending cutscene. Let's spice things up for a moment. I have a small quiz for the audience. So out of the 5 mainline Fatal Frame titles, which one would you say sold the worst? Bear in mind, one of these games was stuck in Japan until just recently, and the fifth entry started off as a Wii U exclusive. Surprisingly, the correct answer would be the first Fatal Frame. It's strange, usually the first installment of a series sells the best, with each subsequent one selling around the same. But unfortunately, the first Fatal Frame game in the series didn't make much of a splash back in the day. Second-hand copies are also stupidly overpriced as a result of this. Please re-release this game, Koei Tecmo. What's also strange is that the reviews for this title at the time of its release was pretty favourable. If I had to make a guess as to why this game didn't sell well, it might have been because it came out just a few months after Silent Hill 2, which might have overshadowed its release as a pre-existing horror series. But Fatal Frame as a whole is still fairly iconic within the horror gaming community. It's the only horror series to ever be represented in Super Smash Bros. As an assist trophy, with Yoriko Zakata from the 5th entry being featured. As a huge fan of horror games, I'd only ever played Maiden of Black Water out of all the games in this series, but going back to its roots, I kinda prefer the first game over it. I found it way scarier with a much darker atmosphere. The way it takes place in one set area instead of it being mission based is something I enjoyed more, and the story as a whole I found way better over the 5th entry. If you're like me before this video and haven't played the first Fatal Frame game yet, then this one comes with one huge recommendation. It's from the absolute golden age of the genre with the PlayStation 2, no other console has come close to this system's diverse and quality library with horror games. Fatal Frame, despite some of its flaws, is more than worth it to stand up there with the best of them. I'm very much looking forward to playing through the other games that I've missed out on from this series. If you managed to get to the end of this video, let me just say thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to support this channel, and happy Halloween. However which way you spend it, I hope you have a nice one.